Well, thank you, Ranking Member Wolarski. I want to thank you for holding this important roundtable. You know, as many Kansans in my district suffer from unemployment due to no fault of their own, they've struggled to receive the benefits and even talk to a live person at the Kansas Department of Labor. And still today, I hear from constituents who have not received the unemployment they rightly deserve. What makes this even worse is that while thousands of Kansans have spent hours and days trying to get hold of someone at the Kansas Department of Labor, millions of dollars in fraudulent claims are being successfully processed. Criminals took advantage of this crisis and hurt hardworking Kansans in the process. We know this has happened across the country as the U.S. Department of Labor has estimated more than $63 billion in unemployment benefits have been improperly paid. Excuse me. Today, I'm pleased to introduce an authority on unemployment fraud in Kansas, State Representative Sean Tarwater. Representative Tarwater chairs the Kansas House Committee on Commerce, Labor, and Economic Development. He serves in the state legislature since 2017, and he's a small business owner who's active in his church and community. Representative Tarwater, can you tell us what you've seen regarding unemployment fraud in Kansas?
Yes, sir. Thank you, and thank you, Ranking Member Wolarski, and thank you to Congressman Estes for allowing me this opportunity. I've already learned a little bit today, and I look forward to seeing what your report ends up being. Kansas is well behind the curve as far as modernization goes, but we're working on it. In addition to being the chairman of the House Commerce Committee, I also vice chaired a joint committee on economic revitalization over the summertime, started in late spring. And that's when our work really began on trying to uncover what was wrong with the unemployment system in Kansas. As far as fraud goes, we identified it very early. The governor of Kansas was one of the first to close the entire state for businesses. That happened in March. And that was despite the fact that most counties had no cases. Middle of the country, and one size fits all happened here. And so she shut down the entire state, and it was well over a month for most areas. And as a result, our UI spiked tremendously. Kansas was lucky, one of the luckiest states. We were in a good spot at that point. We had over $1.2 billion in our unemployment trust fund, and we have less than 3 million people in the state. So we were in a really good position. However, like many other states in our nation, our system was antiquated. We don't have any cross checks. We still really don't. Charge statements are issued only once a year, and the claim statements were delayed by several weeks, which made it so that the employers weren't able to report the fraud in time to be paid, not to be paid. As a result, we were extremely vulnerable. We documented over 40 different times that our Department of Labor, the Kansas Department of Labor, was notified, directed and informed about amassing concerns regarding unemployment fraud. UDOT, the federal government, offered several different times, May 11th and the 19th, as far as fraud alerts and what to do about it. But in all the U-polls that you sent, you held us harmless, and you said that we would not be held harmless for any claims paid that shouldn't have been paid. And as a direct result of that, I think that, our government didn't care either. They didn't care because the U.S. Department of Labor didn't seem to care. Wasn't until, I guess, even in September of 2020, not only did you warn us of fraud, you gave us the software or suggested the software that could fix it, and you funded us by $1.8 million. Our governor did not put those in place until late January, early February. It took 3 days to install that software, and it did cost the $1.8 million that you gave us. And at that point, the fraud seemed to stop, it seemed to fix. It's unfortunate that she waited until that $1.2 billion was almost gone, along with all the other unemployment funds that came in during that time. The worst part of this, I think, was the lack of transparency from the administration. The joint committee that I spoke of earlier pummeled the DOL with questions constantly, every time they were before us, and never had an answer. They were very vague with their answers, and it was almost like they were hiding something. their answer, as far as the fraud, that was our biggest concern. Their answer about the fraud was that the big money was behind the federal funds, and that's what was being targeted. And we were held harmless, so they didn't seem like they wanted to address it until had to. Bottom line is that they didn't care. Early in the process, we identified a loophole in the system where when you went to our system and you typed in a social security number, the first thing you did was type in your social security number. And when you did that, it would self-populate the rest of the information. We realized this because a young lady called in concerned that she typed in an improper social security number and it self-populated with someone else's information. We brought this to the DOL's attention. They denied it, and they said that it was not a big deal, probably didn't happen, and if it did, it was a one-off situation. But we do have video of this happening, and after we put the stops in on late January, early December, or early February, they then said that they stopped over 1 million bots in one day. It's our contention that those 1 million bots were firing social security numbers at that page, and when it populated, they got one right, so it self-populated. That is ID theft, and that is at the fault of our Department of Labor, and that's my biggest concern. Kansas had an 1,800% increase in the rate of reporting identification fraud or identification theft, and that's ranked #1 in the nation. And so we draw. It doesn't take long to draw a straight line between the two.
You know, one of the things, Representative Tarwater, you were talking about just the amount of fraud that happened in the Kansas system and the issues there. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, individuals that were affected by fraud and or that were then having difficulty getting their unemployment because of a fraudulent issue, or just general response in total from the Kansas Department of Labor?
Yes, sir, I'd be glad to. Thank you for the question. So that's the whole crux of this deal. Is there's a big human side to this. The human issue is that while we were spending so much time sifting through thousands of fraudulent claims, there were thousands of Kansans that were losing their cars and losing their houses and trying to feed their children. We've spoken to people that haven't worked since March that called in sometimes hundreds of times a day and never got an answer. That's despite hiring 450 people in a call center. Not sure if they're all working or not, but that's what we're told. Kansas that need the dollars can't get them, yet we're just sending them out in the millions to people that are stealing them. And so, you know, there's a huge human element to this. And when it comes to companies, the employers are they stop trusting the companies. They think the companies have been hacked, and they get these notices, especially in the aviation industry. Several of them thought that when they got this notice that they've lost their job, and it was terrifying to them. And so the human element is huge. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. And you talked a lot about, or you mentioned as part of your discussion that the state being told that they were held harmless for fraud may not have motivated them to actually go out and address that. Are there things that you can think of that might be approaches that we could take in the future to help make sure that, one, we address the fraud and incentivize the states to go address that before they view it as an issue that they don't have to be concerned about?
Yes, so thanks for that question. We're working on that currently, and we've developed a modernization council. I've started to meet with some of the other states. Nebraska is one of them that I just recently met with, and they've got a lot of good ideas. You know, we set aside $100 million for a new modernization system that has all the checks and balances. Nebraska spent $4 on an off-the-shelf program that works quite well. And one of the things we learned from them was, and you know this as well because your wife serves with me in the House of Representatives, and one of the things that she came up with real early was, what about the Patriot Act? I thought people had to in order to open accounts, they had to have an identification and walk in and prove who they were. Yet there are banks that allow that, no ID at all. or little identification at all. And those were the problem that Nebraska identified real early on. And so they don't accept claims from bank accounts that don't require identification. And so that was something we learned right off, because that's where most of the money went.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you taking the time to come today. And obviously there's some issues that we need to address as we move forward. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.